Picture a young American soldier waking up in a frozen foxhole somewhere north of Seoul, January 1951. His breath forms crystalline clouds in air so cold it burns his lungs, and he's wondering how exactly he ended up fighting a war that nobody back home seems particularly interested in discussing. Just 5 years after the ticker-tape parades of World War II, here he is again, except this time, there are no clear battle lines, no obvious villains in distinctive uniforms, and no promise of unconditional surrender ceremonies on battleship decks. Welcome to the Korean War, history's most successful exercise in geopolitical ambiguity, where 3 years of brutal conflict somehow managed to return the map to exactly where it started, leaving behind only scars, separated families, and the world's most awkward ceasefire that technically continues today. The Korean War began, as most forgotten wars do, with a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time and catastrophically naive in retrospect. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Korea, which had been under Japanese occupation since 1910, needed temporary administration while figuring out its post-colonial future. The solution was elegantly simple. Soviet forces would handle everything north of the 38th parallel, while American forces managed the south. This was meant to be temporary, like borrowing your neighbor's lawnmower for a weekend and somehow keeping it for 70 years. Nobody anticipated that temporary administrative convenience would calcify into permanent division, creating two ideologically opposed Korean states that viewed each other with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for former roommates fighting over security deposits. By 1950, both Koreas had developed the confident certainty that they alone represented the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. Kim Il-sung in the north, backed by Stalin's weaponry and Mao's revolutionary enthusiasm, became convinced that a quick military strike could reunify Korea under communist rule before the Americans figured out what was happening. Syngman Rhee in the South harbored similar reunification fantasies, though it involved American military support for a northward campaign. Both leaders possessed that dangerous combination of nationalism and impatience that has started more wars than any ideology ever has. The invasion came at dawn on June 25, 1950, with North Korean forces streaming across the 38th parallel in what they optimistically called a counterattack against Southern provocations that existed primarily in Pyongyang's imagination. Within days, Seoul had fallen, and South Korean forces were retreating so rapidly that American military advisors began seriously discussing evacuation plans. President Truman, determined not to appear weak in the emerging Cold War, made the fateful decision to intervene under the United Nations banner, though the UN authorization was only possible because the Soviet Union was boycotting Security Council meetings over an unrelated diplomatic tantrum, proving that sometimes world history hinges on bureaucratic petulance. General Douglas MacArthur's landing at Incheon in September 1950 was tactically brilliant and strategically disastrous. The amphibious assault caught North Korean forces completely off guard, allowing UN forces to recapture Seoul and push north toward the Chinese border. MacArthur, intoxicated by success and possessed of an ego that could be seen from orbit, began making increasingly grandiose statements about rolling back communism and being home by Christmas. What he failed to adequately consider was that China might have opinions about American forces camping on their border, and that those opinions might be enforced by several 100,000 Chinese volunteers who happen to be remarkably well equipped and organized for civilians. The Chinese intervention transformed the Korean conflict from a regional police action into a genuinely terrifying proxy war between nuclear superpowers. Suddenly, American soldiers who had been advancing toward the Yalu River found themselves facing human wave attacks by Chinese forces who seemed unbothered by casualties that would have horrified Western military planners. The retreat from North Korea became one of the longest retreats in American military history, conducted through mountain passes in temperatures that froze medical plasma and made rifle bolts too stiff to operate properly. What followed was 2 more years of grinding, inconclusive warfare that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the trench fighting of World War I, except with jet aircraft overhead and the constant possibility that someone might decide to use nuclear weapons. The front lines stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel, where they remain today, creating the world's most heavily fortified border and a testament to the power of stubborn geopolitical inertia. Both sides continued fighting, not because either could achieve meaningful victory, but because neither could afford to appear weak by stopping. The human cost of this geopolitical standoff was staggering in ways that statistics can never quite capture. American families received telegrams about sons killed in places they couldn't pronounce, for objectives that government officials struggled to articulate clearly. Korean families were separated by a border that went from administrative convenience to permanent barrier overnight, creating millions of personal tragedies that continue to this day. Chinese families lost sons in a war that was never officially acknowledged as a war, fighting for strategic objectives that had little to do with Chinese interests and everything to do with communist solidarity. The armistice signed in July 1953 wasn't really a peace treaty. It was more like an exhausted agreement to stop shooting while continuing to glare menacingly across a demilitarized zone that became one of the world's most militarized borders. Neither side achieved their original objectives. Both sides claimed victory in their domestic propaganda, and Korea remained divided along lines that were depressingly similar to where the whole mess started. The Korean War's designation as the Forgotten War reflects something profound about how democracies process ambiguous conflicts. World War II offered clear moral narratives and decisive victories that fit comfortably into national mythologies. Korea offered 3 years of casualties in service of a stalemate that left everyone roughly where they started, except poorer and more suspicious of each other. It was the first hot war of the Cold War era, establishing patterns of proxy conflict and limited engagement that would characterize the next 40 years of international relations. Sleep peacefully, knowing that some of history's most consequential conflicts are the ones that end not with dramatic surrenders or triumphant parades, but with tired diplomats signing papers that nobody particularly likes, creating solutions that solve nothing but somehow manage to prevent everything from getting worse.